The Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, know that they have been rumbled. That is the only explanation behind their truly deranged statement, suggesting that Tom Bower, one of Britain's most respected authors, someone who had a long career of revealing the truth about high-profile figures from Muhammad al-Fayed to Simon Cowell for years before he tackled Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, is somehow a conspiracy theorist.
And so he became hypersensitive and blamed the media for the crashes of his relationships, never thinking that they could have something to do with himself. So he's a very complicated, depressed, unintelligent man who is seeking a role and has got really nobody on whom he could rely, which is in the end where Meghan stepped in. I mean, a needy man met a woman who...
A quiet shift behind palace walls, a signature made in trust, and a clause buried deep enough to change everything. What once looked like a modern royal love story is now being re-examined through a far darker lens, one where timing, control, and strategy may have been carefully aligned from the very beginning. The clause that changed everything. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just the idea of a marriage under pressure. It's the possibility that the pressure was never accidental. That what we're witnessing now may not be a breakdown, but the slow reveal of something carefully structured years ago. Because when Tom Bower began looking deeper into Harry and Meghan's relationship, he wasn't chasing gossip. He was following a pattern. A pattern built on legal structure, financial timing, and decisions that, at first glance, seemed ordinary, but together start to form a very different picture. Bower isn't just another voice in the media cycle. He's a former barrister, an investigative journalist who has spent decades exposing powerful figures who believed they were beyond scrutiny. When he writes, it's not guesswork, it's built like a case. Interviews, documentation, legal insight, everything designed to withstand pressure. And that's exactly why what he uncovered has people paying attention. Because according to his findings, there's one specific detail, buried deep inside a legal agreement, that changes how this entire relationship is viewed. Not publicly, not emotionally, but structurally. A clause. Not part of the original fairy tale moment in 2018, when the world watched them marry under the arches of Windsor. No, this came later. Quietly, without headlines, without public attention. An amendment. And that's where the timeline begins to matter. Around 2020, everything in their lives was shifting. They were stepping away from royal duties, moving across continents, entering into massive commercial deals. Netflix, Spotify, new ventures, new identities. It looked like independence, reinvention, a couple building something together on their own terms. But legally, that moment required updates. Prenuptial agreements aren't static. They evolve. When circumstances change, money, business, location, the contracts change too. That's standard. Expected, even. What isn't expected is how much power a single amendment can hold. Because Bower's sources suggest that during this exact period, right as the deals were being signed and the money started flowing, an additional clause was introduced. A clause tied not just to assets, but to control. Control over earnings. Control over business structures. And more importantly, control over what happens if everything falls apart. Now, on the surface, that might sound like standard legal protection. Every high-profile couple has safeguards, especially when millions are involved. But this wasn't just about splitting money. This went deeper. It extended into intellectual property, into ownership of their shared brand, into the very narrative that made them valuable in the first place. Because their story, their interviews, their deals, their public identity, wasn't just personal anymore. It had become business. And someone needed to own it. According to what Bower uncovered, Meghan wasn't just part of that structure. She was positioned at the center of it. Listed in key roles, driving negotiations, structuring deals, ensuring that legally, the framework leaned in her favor if things ever changed. And that's where the dynamic shifts. Because while one side was building trust, The other may have been building leverage. There's also something else that stands out when you follow this timeline closely. The difference in approach. The difference in behavior. On one side, a pattern of emotional decision-making. Legal battles. Public statements. Reactions driven by pressure and frustration. On the other, precision. Calculated moves. Strategic positioning. Long-term thinking. And those differences don't feel random when you look at them through this lens. Because Bauer didn't just look at the contract. He looked at history. He spoke to people connected to Meghan's previous marriage. Legal professionals who described a very specific trait, attention to detail. Every clause read. Every condition questioned. Nothing signed without full understanding. A methodical approach. And that raises a difficult question. If that same level of precision was applied here, then nothing inside that agreement was accidental. Nothing was overlooked. Nothing was misunderstood. Except, possibly by one person. Because according to the claims, this amendment, the one that now sits at the center of this entire theory, was signed by Harry without fully grasping its long-term implications. Not out of carelessness, but out of trust. And that's the part that changes everything. Because trust, in this context, isn't just emotional. It's legal. And once it's written into a contract, it doesn't fade when the relationship does. It stays. Binding. Silent. Waiting. So when people now look back at the timeline, the deals, the relocation, the shift from royalty to business, they're starting to ask a different kind of question. Not what went wrong, but when did this really begin? Because if this structure was built during their rise, then what we're seeing now may not be the collapse of a marriage at all. It may be the execution of something that was quietly put in place years ago. The power behind the brand. If Section 1 revealed the existence of a clause, then Section 2 begins to reveal what that clause was really protecting. Because once you move past the emotional narrative, the headlines, the interviews, the public appearances, you start to see something far more calculated taking shape behind the scenes. Not a relationship, but a business structure. And at the center of that structure was something far more valuable than titles or status. Control. As Harry and Meghan transitioned into their post-royal life, the world saw opportunity. Multi-million-dollar deals. Global platforms. A modern reinvention of what a royal identity could become outside the palace walls. Netflix. Spotify. Publishing. Speaking engagements. It looked like partnership. But legally, partnerships are rarely equal. According to the details uncovered in Bauer's investigation, the real foundation of their empire wasn't just built on shared vision, it was built on carefully assigned roles. And those roles weren't symbolic. They were contractual. Because within their joint ventures, Meghan wasn't just a participant. She was positioned as the operator, the negotiator, the one listed at the front of business registrations, the one directly tied to the deals, the one whose name appeared first in key documents connected to their ventures. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because in legal terms, being the face of a brand is very different from owning the structure behind it. And when Bauer's sources began looking closely at how those deals were structured, one detail stood out above everything else: the way control was distributed. Not publicly, but internally. Take their major contracts, for example. On the surface, they were presented as joint achievements. A couple building something together. A shared journey into media and influence. But beneath that surface, the ownership lines weren't as balanced as they appeared. Because under California law, anything earned during a marriage can be considered community property. That includes media deals, royalties, intellectual property, everything. Which means, in the absence of specific protections, everything is split. 50-50. Simple. But this is where that amendment begins to take on a different meaning. Because according to Bauer's findings, the clause didn't just address money. It addressed ownership of the ideas, the content, and the identity they were selling to the world. Who owns the story? Who controls the brand? Who decides what happens to it if the partnership ends? Those aren't emotional questions. They're legal ones. And the answers, according to what's been uncovered, may not favor Harry. Because Meghan's role wasn't just visible, it was strategic. She negotiated deals. She structured partnerships. She was directly involved in shaping the business side of their empire. And more importantly, she ensured that her position within that structure gave her leverage. Not just during the relationship, but after it. There's also something else that becomes clear when you follow the timeline closely: the shift from joint visibility to individual positioning. Around 2022, subtle changes began to appear. Separate projects, independent branding, business ventures registered under a single name, not both. At first, it looked like diversification. A smart move, expanding beyond a shared identity into individual growth. But when viewed through the lens of legal strategy, it looks different. Because separating income streams isn't just about growth. It's about protection. It's about ensuring that if one structure collapses, the other remains intact. And that pattern starts to repeat. A lifestyle brand launched under Meghan's name alone. Trademark filings that exclude Harry entirely. Solo business meetings. Independent media projects. Each move, on its own, seems harmless, even logical. But together, they form a blueprint. A gradual shift from shared dependency to complete independence. And that's where things become difficult to ignore. Because while one side appeared to be navigating the pressures of public life, court cases, media battles, personal struggles, the other side was quietly reinforcing a separate foundation. One that didn't rely on the marriage to survive. And when you combine that with the existence of a clause that governs control over shared assets and intellectual property, the picture becomes clearer. This wasn't just about building success together. It may have been about preparing for what happens when that success needs to be divided. Because in high-profile relationships like this, the real power isn't in what you earn. It's in what you keep. And more importantly, what you control after everything else falls apart. So when people now look at the brand they built, the interviews, the documentaries, the deals, they're starting to question something deeper. Was this ever truly equal? Or was it structured from the beginning to ensure that if the partnership ended, only one side would walk away with the keys to everything they created? The timeline that doesn't add up. By now, the structure is becoming clearer. The clause, the control, the positioning. But what truly unsettles investigators isn't just what was written, it's when everything started to shift. Because if this was simply a relationship evolving under pressure, the timeline would feel chaotic, unpredictable, reactive. But it doesn't. It feels aligned. And that's what makes it harder to ignore. Because when Tom Bauer and his sources began mapping key events against financial decisions and legal adjustments, a pattern started to emerge. One that suggests this wasn't a sudden unraveling, but a slow, deliberate transition. The turning point, according to multiple insiders, sits firmly around 2022. Not 2024. Not 2025. 2 years earlier. That's when the visible partnership began to quietly fragment. And at first, no one noticed. Because on the surface, everything still looked intact. Public appearances. Joint messaging. Carefully curated moments that reinforced the idea of unity. But behind that, something else was happening. Because 2022 is when Meghan began restructuring her financial identity. Not dramatically, not publicly, but strategically. This is when trademark filings started appearing under her name alone, most notably tied to a lifestyle brand that had no formal connection to Harry. A brand built independently, legally separated from their shared ventures. At the time, it looked like a personal project, a side venture. But in legal terms, it was something far more significant. It was separation. The creation of an income stream that existed entirely outside the marriage structure. And that move wasn't isolated. Because around the same period, other shifts began to surface. Solo meetings in Los Angeles. Independent negotiations. Projects that carried her name, but not his. Even public appearances started to change. Fewer joint moments. More individual positioning. A subtle but noticeable recalibration of identity. And when you align those changes with the structure of their agreements, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Because this wasn't happening randomly. It was happening in sequence. One move building on another. One layer reinforcing the next. And that's exactly what financial advisors, particularly those experienced in high net worth separations, recognize immediately. Preparation. Because when someone begins isolating assets, separating income streams, and establishing independent control over business entities, it typically signals one thing. Not uncertainty, but anticipation. And according to Bauer's findings, this wasn't just about business. It extended into how money itself was being handled. Because sources familiar with their financial structure pointed to a series of adjustments beginning in that same period. Accounts restructured. Investments repositioned. Assets carefully organized under specific legal protections. Even their Montecito property, one of their most valuable holdings, was reportedly positioned in a way that aligns with California's homestead laws, offering an added layer of security. Again, none of this is unusual on its own. Wealthy individuals do this all the time. But timing is everything. And here, the timing tells a story. Because all of these moves began after their major deals were signed, but before any public signs of strain became undeniable. Which means, this wasn't a reaction to failure. It was preparation before it. And that's where things take a more serious turn. Because if these decisions were made during a period when the relationship was still publicly stable, then the intent behind them becomes harder to explain away as coincidence. Especially when you consider another key detail uncovered in the investigation: the shift away from joint ventures toward individual control. Because once those independent structures were in place, something else began to change. Reliance. The need for a shared financial future started to disappear. Because when one side builds a system that can function independently, financially, legally, and publicly, the balance of the relationship shifts. Quietly, but permanently. And that shift doesn't need to be announced. It simply exists. Which brings us back to the clause. Because if that amendment was designed to define control in the event of a separation, and the financial moves began aligning with that outcome years in advance, then the timeline stops looking like a series of unrelated decisions. It starts looking like a roadmap that leads somewhere very specific. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a roadmap that only one person may have been fully aware of. Because while one side was navigating legal battles, public pressure, and emotional strain, the other side appears to have been executing a plan that required patience, precision, and above all, time. Time to build independence. Time to secure assets. Time to ensure that when the moment came, everything would already be in place. So now, as observers begin connecting these points, the clause, the control, the financial shifts, they're no longer asking whether something changed. They're asking something far more uncomfortable. Was this ever about reacting to circumstances? Or was it about preparing for an outcome that had already been decided long before anyone else could see it? The signals no one took seriously. By the time the financial shifts were in motion, the next phase didn't begin with a legal filing. It began with perception. Because in high-profile separations, what the public believes often matters just as much as what the contracts say. And according to those familiar with how these situations unfold, the real groundwork isn't laid in courtrooms. It's laid in narrative. Quietly, gradually, and often, long before anyone realizes what's happening. Because one of the most revealing details in this entire timeline isn't hidden in a document. It's found in a decision that, at first glance, seemed almost routine. The rehiring of a PR firm. Not just any firm, but Sunshine Sachs. A name that carries weight in Hollywood for one very specific reason. Crisis management. High-profile image control. And perhaps most importantly, strategic positioning during major personal transitions. When Meghan first worked with him years earlier, it was during the rise, when the relationship was new, the attention intense, and the narrative still forming. But then they were gone. Replaced. Reportedly because of budget decisions or a desire for more internal control. At the time, it seemed like a simple business choice. But fast forward to January 2026, and suddenly they're back. And for those who understand how these firms operate, that timing doesn't feel random. Because in cases involving potential separation, especially at this level, PR isn't reactive. It's proactive. Experts in this field often begin shaping public perception months in advance. Subtle story placements, image recalibration, quiet shifts in tone, not to announce what's happening, but to prepare the audience for it. And when Bauer's sources looked at this move in context, with everything else already in place, it started to look less like a business decision, and more like a signal. Because the return of a firm known for handling complex, high-stakes personal transitions doesn't happen without purpose. Especially not when it aligns with a timeline already filled with structural changes. But that wasn't the only signal. Because around the same time, something else began to shift: public positioning. Appearances became more selective. Engagements more calculated. Moments that once reinforced unity began to feel managed. There were fewer organic interactions, fewer shared narratives, more emphasis on individual identity, and perhaps most telling of all, a growing sense of distance. Not dramatic, not headline-grabbing, but noticeable enough that observers began asking quiet questions. Why the change? Why now? Because when relationships begin to strain under pressure, the signs are usually messy, emotional, unpredictable. But this felt controlled, measured, as if each move was being placed carefully, one after another, toward a specific outcome. And then there's another layer that adds to this picture: the management of reputation. Because in situations like this, timing isn't just about legal readiness. It's about public sympathy. Who is seen as stable? Who appears consistent? Who holds credibility when the narrative finally shifts? And when you look closely at the changes happening during this period, you begin to see a pattern that aligns with that objective. Independent projects gaining visibility. Personal branding being reinforced. Professional identity being separated from the relationship itself. All while the shared narrative becomes quieter, less central, less defining. And that's not accidental. Because in the world of high-profile separations, the strongest position isn't built at the moment of announcement. It's built long before it. Through perception, through positioning, through the careful shaping of how the story will be understood when it finally comes to light. And this is where everything begins to connect. Because when you place the PR shift alongside the financial restructuring, alongside the independent business ventures, alongside the clause that governs control, it forms something that no longer feels like coincidence. It feels like coordination, a sequence of moves designed not just to protect assets, but to control the narrative that will define what happens next. And perhaps the most striking part of all this is how invisible it remained for so long. Because none of these decisions, on their own, would have raised alarm. A PR change? Normal. A new business venture? Expected. Separate projects? Logical. But together, they tell a different story. A story of preparation not just for a private transition, but for a public one. Because when the moment arrives, when the headlines finally shift, when the legal process begins, when everything becomes visible, the outcome won't just depend on what's written in contracts. It will depend on what people believe. And right now, it looks like that belief may already be quietly taking shape, long before anyone is officially told what's really happening behind the scenes. When the trap finally closes, and this is where everything stops being theoretical and starts becoming inevitable. Because once the structure is in place, the assets secured, and the narrative quietly shaped, there's only one thing left: execution. According to the timeline Bauer outlines, the final phase isn't chaotic. It's not emotional. It's not even public. At least, not at first. It's procedural. Because in California, divorce doesn't begin with headlines. It begins with filing. And once that filing happens, a sequence of legal mechanisms is triggered automatically. Mechanisms that don't rely on emotion or intent, only on what has already been agreed, signed, and structured. That's where the clause returns. Not as a theory, but as a controlling force. Because if what Bauer's sources suggest is accurate, then the amendment signed years earlier doesn't just influence the outcome. It defines it. Ownership of shared ventures. Control of intellectual property. Access to revenue streams built during the marriage. Even decision-making authority over the brand they created together. All of it, governed by words written long before any separation becomes official. And that's why this moment matters. Because by the time legal proceedings begin, it's already too late to renegotiate. Too late to revisit. Too late to question what was signed in trust. Because contracts don't care about intention, only agreement. And according to the claims surrounding this case, that agreement may place Harry in a position far more exposed than anyone initially realized. There's also another dimension, one that goes beyond money or control. Custody. Because while financial assets can be divided, negotiated, or restructured, stability becomes the central argument when children are involved. And in California courts, patterns matter. Who is present? Who provides consistency? Who appears to be the primary anchor in the children's daily lives? And when Bauer's timeline is placed against this standard, it raises difficult implications. Frequent travel. Ongoing legal battles. Periods of separation tied to professional obligations. All of these factors can shape how custody decisions are viewed. Not emotionally, but practically. And when combined with the structural advantage already outlined in the financial agreements, it creates a position that becomes increasingly difficult to counter. Then there's the final layer, the one most people overlook. Debt. Because while assets are being protected, structured, and secured, liabilities don't disappear. Legal battles. Security costs. Ongoing expenses tied to public life. And according to the analysis, some of these pressures may not be evenly distributed. Which raises one last, uncomfortable possibility. What if the financial strain isn't just a consequence of the situation, but part of it? Because if one side is insulated, through independent income, protected assets, and strategic positioning, while the other continues to absorb the weight of ongoing costs, then the imbalance doesn't just exist in contracts. It exists in real time. And that imbalance only grows stronger as the situation moves closer to resolution. So when Bauer delivers his final assessment, it isn't dramatic for effect. It's clinical. A conclusion drawn from patterns, timing, and structure. That by the time the separation becomes official, the outcome may already be decided. Not in court, but on paper. Years earlier. Because the most powerful moves in situations like this aren't made at the end. They're made at the beginning. Quietly, deliberately, and often, without the other side fully realizing what they've agreed to until it's far too late. And now, as this entire story continues to unfold, one question lingers above everything else. Was this a relationship that slowly fell apart under pressure? Or a structure that was carefully built to withstand that exact moment? Because if everything we've just walked through is even partially true, then what looked like a love story to the world may have always been something else entirely behind the scenes. If you found this breakdown revealing, make sure to stay tuned, because when the next development hits, it won't just confirm what's happening. It will expose how much of it was planned all along. And sometimes, the most important details aren't the ones announced loudly. They're the ones hidden quietly, waiting for the right moment to be understood.